They roll me back into the ward, and my first thought, ridiculous as it sounds, was whether the 57 would start when I next climbed behind its wheel. That car has been with me longer than most people in my life, and the thought of her waiting in the garage gave me comfort when the beeping machines and antiseptic smell try to make me feel small. Before I go any further, let me pause here. If you've ever had something precious taken from you, you'll know exactly why I have to tell this story. And if you're new here, welcome. This is where I share stories of betrayal, justice, and payback the way life writes them. If you've been around for a while, thank you for riding with me. You're the reason I keep telling these tales. Please subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment if you've ever had family or friends cross a line. And if you know someone who loves classic cars, share this story with them. They'll understand just how deep this cut went. Now, back to the mess. I'm not some rich guy with an ego and a showy driveway. Those cars were my ledger of a life. Each one had a backstory stitched to it. The Dodge I rebuilt after a layoff in my 30s, the Triumph I bought with the first decent check after the factory shut down, the 57 Chevy my father drove to every county fair. I'd learned to weld at 15, learned to wait for parts at midnight, learned the patient art of bargaining with men who love chrome as much as I did. The garage behind the house, 2 bays, an attic full of dusty parts and handwritten service logs, was my church. I prayed with a torque wrench. So when the ER doc told me I needed a routine operation and a one-night stay, I called my nephew Mark to swing by and check on the boilers and feed the cat. Nothing dramatic. Mark's a decent enough kid in his 30s, likes fast coffee and faster talk. He'd helped me lift an engine block before. My other nephew, Jared, stopped by less often, but we joked over beers about tossing the old lawnmower at his bachelor party. I trusted them both enough to hand over a key to the front gate and the garage door opener. Trust, as I was about to relearn, is a lazy thing until someone proves you wrong. The surgery went fine. Someone in the hospital even joked about me being back to tinker the next afternoon. I remember that laugh and how it felt like a promise. I slept, woke, and the first thing I asked the nurse, because habit carves itself into you, was, "Did someone check the back door?" She smiled, told me not to worry, and rattled the overnight paperwork. There's a surreal bit of time in hospitals where being whole and being whole again feel like different currencies. I wanted my garage like I wanted my shoes, sensible, familiar, exactly where I left them. They discharged me mid-morning. I made the drive home with that peculiar, slow thrill of being allowed back into normal life. The light hit the pine trees the way it always had. The neighbor's dog barked, but when I turned into my own drive, my heart did something like a flat tire. The garage doors were down, not open down. The panel had a newer oil streak on the concrete where a dolly might have rolled. The mailbox had a handful of envelopes with folded corners, including a collection of receipts that looked like they'd been filed by hand and not by me. Mark and Jared were on the porch, their smiles the rehearsed kind that mean something heavy is being hidden. Mark tried to joke about my big reveal, like he had a key to a surprise party. Jared clapped me on the back. I walked past them, and the smell hit, not oil and grease the way it should have, but the hollow echo of empty space. I asked for the keys. They looked at each other. "We sold a couple," Mark said like he was naming a garden project. "Cleared out some of the stuff. Figured you'd want the house less cluttered while you healed." "Sold?" The word landed like a dropped wrench. "Which ones?" My voice was steady because shock makes you practical. Mark named 2 models, a Ford and a Triumph, and said something about quick buyers and cash deals. He showed me a crumpled receipt for a bank deposit into an account I'd never seen before. My hands found the air like they might grab at paper and find it tangible. There was no mention of the Chevy, not yet. There was no mention of the 57. They used the word help a lot. "We thought we were doing you a favor." There was the old family rhetoric. Help, concern, responsibility. They said it with the cadence of someone who's getting very good at explaining why they did what they did. I asked to see the logs, the little notebooks I kept. Engine numbers, dates, original titles. Mark shifted, thumbed his phone like a man who'd rather show me a screen than open a drawer. Jared smiled a smile I used to like and then didn't. That night, after the calls and the legal-sounding words I didn't know any better to use, I sat on the empty garage step and let the night come on slow. The pain from the incision was nothing compared to the cold in my chest where those cars used to be. The house echoed. I had the keys, but not the histories tied to them. You learn the worth of your work the way you learn the texture of an engine block under your palms, by touch and time. They'd taken touch and turned it into a bank ledger. This is where the story properly begins, not in the hospital bed, but on that step with the smell of lawn clippings and regrets. I promise you, they made a colossal mistake. I started a list that night. Who bought what titles had signatures, what boxes in the attic might hide originals. Revenge in my world wouldn't be loud. It would be slow, methodical, legal where it mattered, personal where it hurt. I slept badly and woke with one certainty. I was not finished with those men on my porch. The next morning, I woke up with a stiffness in my side from the stitches, but it was nothing compared to the stiffness in my jaw from clenching it all night. My garage had never been silent before. There was always a tick from a cooling engine, a drip from a line, the faint metallic echo of machines at rest. Now, it was the silence of loss, like a church stripped of pews. I made coffee the way I always did and spread the crumpled receipt Mark had given me on the table. The ink was still fresh. The deposit wasn't into my account, wasn't even into anything that carried my name. The number scrawled at the bottom wasn't a bank reference I recognized. I may not be a financial genius, but I've spent decades keeping logs of every part I've bought, every dime that went into those cars. Nothing about this slip felt like me. When you've rebuilt engines, you learn a thing or two about patience. You don't just crank and hope. You inspect, you listen, you gather. And that's exactly what I decided I'd do, gather. My nephews thought I'd be too weak, too grateful to be alive to care. They hadn't counted on the fact that betrayal sharpens you, even when age or surgery try to dull you. I started upstairs, in the attic where I kept the binders. The air was musty, filled with dust from cardboard boxes stacked like an archive of my life. Inside the first binder were the titles, carefully wrapped in plastic sleeves. I flipped through them one by one, each car like a chapter: Chevy, Dodge, Triumph, Plymouth. My fingers slowed when I reached the Ford. The original title was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. I checked the Triumph. Same thing. My handwriting was there, my logs intact, but the most important documents had vanished. I felt my stomach twist. Someone had been through my things while I was gone, and it wasn't just the garage. I climbed back down with the binders, wincing as my side reminded me I wasn't at full strength. I sat at the kitchen table, binder open, and let the rage simmer into clarity. If they had the titles, they could make the sales look legitimate. Buyers might not ask too many questions if the seller smiled and flashed family ties. But here's the thing they didn't know. I'd always made duplicate notations of VIN numbers, kept backup photos, and stored copies in a folder labeled in a way no one else would think twice about old tax returns. That night, when the house was still, I went into my file cabinet and pulled it out. There were VINs, purchase dates, even pictures of me with each car, county fairs, and shows. Proof that these weren't just a couple of old vehicles. They were documented pieces of my life. The next step was obvious. I needed to find out who had bought them. Not the names Mark or Jared gave me, the real buyers. Because I knew in my bones my nephews hadn't just sold a couple. The way they avoided talking about the Chevy, the way they kept glancing at each other, something bigger was going on. I called Mark the next morning, voice calm. "I want the names of the buyers," I said. "Full names." He hesitated, then said he'd check his phone and get back to me. Hours passed with no call. Finally, Jared showed up, uninvited, carrying takeout bags like that would patch the wound. He dropped the food on the counter, forced a laugh, and said, "We thought we'd bring dinner. Cheer you up." I didn't touch the food. "Where's the Chevy?" I asked. My tone left no room for dodging. His face flickered. "What Chevy?" "The 57, I said, leaning forward. "Don't play dumb with me. Where is it?" He stammered about a serious collector who couldn't pass up the offer. That told me everything. They hadn't just flipped my cars to cover expenses or stash a little cash. They were liquidating my collection, piece by piece, probably at bargain prices, to whoever waved the most cash under their noses. I told Jared to leave. He muttered something about me overreacting and being too sentimental, but I didn't budge. When the door closed behind him, I knew what I had to do: track the paper trail, and if they thought they could gaslight me into believing it was just a couple cars, I'd prove otherwise. That night, I made 3 calls. One was to an old friend of mine, Ray, who still ran the county auto registry. The second was to a mechanic buddy who'd once tipped me off about shady buyers in the area. And the third, the most important, was to a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years, but whose card I'd kept just in case. By the end of the week, I had answers. Ray pulled a few strings and found recent title transfers that matched my VIN numbers. My mechanic buddy gave me the names of 2 buyers who'd bragged about scoring classics for dirt cheap. And my lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. If I still had my documentation, I had a case. The pieces were falling into place. My nephews hadn't just betrayed me. They'd underestimated me. They thought age and surgery meant weakness. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent a lifetime solving puzzles under the hood, fixing what was broken, and keeping track of every nut and bolt. I stood in the garage one evening, binder in hand, looking at the empty concrete where chrome once gleamed. For the first time in days, I didn't just feel loss. I felt purpose. They had taken my cars, but I still had my titles, my proof, and my patience. And soon, very soon, I would have their downfall. By the time I reached the 3rd day after waking from surgery, the incision had stopped feeling like the main wound. The larger cut, the one across my life, began to throb with every passing hour. I'd expected stubbornness from my nephews, a lot of fumbled excuses and nervous laughter. I hadn't expected malice dressed up like convenience. People will surprise you in ugly ways when money smells fresh. I started where any stubborn old man with a ledger and pride would, with the paper. Ray from the registry called back with 2 title transfers flagged as recent. One matched the Ford, the other matched the Triumph. The buyer names were bland, company names, shell-type things, but one entry had a forwarding address that put it at a storage lot not 10 miles from town. I drove over, binder in the passenger seat, hands gripping the steering wheel the way they tighten around a steering column when you're about to take a corner too fast. The storage lot was a place that smells like rubber and dust and late regrets. I asked the attendant about unit numbers and half expected him to be as tight-lipped as most folks are about other people's property. He squinted at my printed VIN, ended up walking with me down the row, and stopped at a unit with stickers on the door and a tarp peeking from the bottom. When he lifted the tarp, chrome caught the light like a promise I thought lost. The front fender of the Chevy, unmistakable even when covered. I swallowed. For a moment, the years melted into metal. Dad pushing that Chevy up a gravel road, my hands under that hood learning how the world could be coaxed back into order. I called Mark. He answered on the second ring like nothing was wrong. "Find anything?" he said, cheerful, like he'd been expecting a compliment. "You're not supposed to be out driving," he added. "Doctor's orders." He'd learned the condescension of worry well. I let him have it for 30 seconds, enough to make him uncomfortable. Then I said, "Who is the broker who moved these? Give me a name." There was a long pause. "We used a man named Roscoe," he finally said. "He moves collectibles. He's got connections." The word connections always meant discretion in their mouths. It meant quick cash and quiet hands. It also meant I'd finally found a trail that smelled like other people's ambition. Roscoe, I found out, was a dealer who'd shown up at the local swap meets with a slick car trailer and a smile that made men hand over keys too quick. He had a small showroom 2 towns over and a reputation for buying estate collections. I called his number and told him I was Tom. Not the old man, not the patient recuperating from a hospital stay, just Tom who wanted to check on his assets. He laughed like he'd been waiting for me. "We're cleaning out for you, man. You've got a big estate on your hands," he said, and the words tasted like vinegar. I asked for receipts for bill of sale copies. He told me, It was between him and the family, and that he'd handle the paperwork. I asked whom he'd spoken to, and he named my nephews. He also dropped a name that made my stomach drop, a man named Clifton, a lawyer in our county who'd handled estate work for a lot of families. Clifton's name should have been a red flag, a comfort even. He was supposed to keep things tidy, not invisible. I didn't want to believe my nephews had dragged a lawyer into this. Lawyers are the scaffolding of intentions. They either shore you up or help you bury things. I called Clifton. He was brusque at first, then oddly tender, like a man who'd been searching for the best words to use about helping the family. He told me he'd facilitated some paperwork at their request during my hospital stay. He claimed they'd shown him what looked like sign titles. His voice was careful. His words were carefuler. I asked him to come by. He agreed, but not that day. His calendar, he said, was full. When Clifton finally arrived a week later, he carried himself like a man wearing someone else's conscience. He smiled at me, shook my hand, and said, "Tom, I'm so sorry about your operation." He sat at my kitchen table and talked in circles about how sometimes the elderly prefer less clutter, about how families make tough choices for the good of the patriarch. I watched his mouth and read the pauses that told me he'd been coaching someone on how to speak. I asked him outright, "Did you notarize any documents removing my name from titles?" He shifted, fingers drumming the wood like a warning. "Yes," he said. "I signed documents as witnesses on a couple. They brought them to me and said you wanted them gone." The words landed like a hammer. "You signed?" I asked. He smiled that lawyer's smile and explained in slow rationalities how, in the rush, a signature could be forged, a stamp misapplied, a memory misremembered. He offered to help rectify it legally for a fee. The betrayal morphed into something uglier. Officialdom had been weaponized. If my nephews had forged my signature, had used Clifton's presence to launder legitimacy, I was up against a web. A few greedy hands, a compliant lawyer, and buyers who didn't care where the cars came from as long as the chrome shone. I felt like a man who'd found termites in his foundation. The house looked fine until you put a flashlight to it and discovered the core was eaten. I told Clifton I wanted copies of every document he'd touched. He gave me a vague timeline and promised to mail papers. I didn't want promises. I wanted paper. So that night, I went through drawers, not like a thief, but like a historian. I wanted receipts, phone records, text messages, anything that showed intent. It was slow work. I wasn't as quick as I used to be, but I'd still been a master of precision under duress. One lie always leads to another, and that's what I found. Texts between Mark and Roscoe arranging times, messages from Jared to Clifton thanking him for being discreet, a photo Mark had taken, a crooked grin, keys in hand, the Chevy in the background with the tarp half off, the same Chevy they pretended not to remember. I sat there with my phone and felt a cold satisfaction lace through me. They'd been careless in their confidence. Careless people make good evidence. There was one more thing I discovered that night, and it stung worse than the loss of Chrome, a notarized document, and signed by me, but with my name printed and what looked like a shaky imitation of my signature at the bottom. Whoever forged it had done enough to fool an honest man and not enough to fool someone who'd spent a life reading marks. I put the paper down and looked at the house around me. The living room where my father's chair still sat, the mantel with pictures, the kitchen table we just used for dinner. Those objects felt like witnesses. I felt like I'd been led into my own life while blindfolded. They'd made the mistake of thinking that because I'd been under the hospital lights, I'd be too weak to see through their tidy story. They'd made the larger mistake of being sloppy. I could exploit. I went to bed that night with a list in my head, not of hurts, but of steps. Evidence to secure, witnesses to interview, legal motions to file. I dug the first spadeful of dirt and found something rotten. Now I knew where to dig next. By the time the third week rolled around, my stitches had healed enough for me to move like myself again. What hadn't healed, what couldn't, was the way my own blood had stripped me bare. Every time I walked past the garage, I saw ghosts where cars should have been, chrome-shaped absences that whispered, They think you're too weak to fight back. That whisper was what kept me moving. I had the Vince, the photographs, and now, thanks to my late-night digging, proof of the forgery. But evidence by itself is like an engine block without spark. Heavy, silent, and waiting for the right ignition. What I needed was a spark that would make Mark and Jared sweat, something that would force their smooth, little lies to stumble. I started small. A friend at the registry agreed to, accidentally, let slip to Mark that there were questions being raised about the transfers. It didn't take long before Mark was blowing up my phone with calls I ignored. Let him sweat. Jared, on the other hand, tried the soft approach, showing up with groceries and a fake smile, trying to play the dutiful nephew. I let him in, let him set the bags on the counter, then dropped the photograph I'd found, the one with him grinning next to my Chevy onto. I said, "You boys weren't careful. You thought because I was under the knife, I wouldn't notice." Jared's voice cracked just a little when he said, "Uncle Tom, it's not like that. We were trying to help. You can't keep all these cars forever. What were you planning to do with them?" That was the moment I understood the heart of it. This wasn't just about greed. It was about entitlement. They decided for me what my life's work was worth. And worse, they decided who deserved it more. I leaned forward, kept my voice calm. "You didn't just sell cars. You sold history. You sold the only proof I had that years meant something. And you sold it like it was clutter." He didn't answer. He left instead, muttering about how I couldn't see the bigger picture. Good. Let him run back to Mark. Let them both know the old man wasn't fooled. The next step was Roscoe, the dealer. I walked into his little showroom, the kind of place that smelled like polished dashboards and too much cologne. He looked me over with that thin smile of his, all salesman charm. "Tom," he said, "glad you're up and about. The boys told me you were recovering." "The boys lied," I said flatly. "You've got cars that don't belong to them. You've got my Chevy, and I've got proof." His smile faltered just for a second. Then he leaned back in his chair and spread his hands like a man dealing cards. "Look, I bought what I thought was fair and legal. They came with papers. They said it was all above board." I set a copy of the forged signature down on his desk. His eyes narrowed. "You want to keep your license, Roscoe?" I asked. "Then you're going to help me. You're going to tell me exactly where the Chevy is, who else you sold to, and every dollar you paid them." There was silence, just the hum of an old ceiling fan. Then he sighed, the kind of sign men make when they know the easy money has turned toxic. "Fine," he said, "but you didn't hear it from me." He slid a notepad across the desk, names scribbled in his messy hand. Buyers, prices, dates. And at the bottom, Clifton, retainer paid. That name again. The lawyer who was supposed to protect, not plunder. Driving home, I felt the kind of focus I hadn't had in years. My nephews had made one mistake selling my cars. Roscoe had made his mistake trusting them. But Clifton had made the mistake of putting his reputation on the line for two amateurs. And reputations, once cracked, don't polish back to shine. That night, I pulled together everything. Then logs, photos, the forged signature, Roscoe's list. I put them in a folder, neat and deliberate, the way I'd once laid out tools before an engine rebuild. Because that's what this was now, a rebuild. Not of cars, but of my name, my ownership, my dignity. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd start the real fight. Not with fists or shouting. With filings, subpoenas, and a very public reminder that you don't strip a man of his life's work without paying dearly. And when it was over, Mark and Jared would wish they'd left me to my garage in peace. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I found myself agreeing with that more each night I lay awake planning the end. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted paperwork that snapped like a trap, a courtroom that clicked shut, and the slow, sinking feeling in the guilty when they realized the noise of their own lies had been louder than their courage. For 3 weeks, I've been patient, methodical. Vince logged, receipts copied, witnesses nudged. Now it's time to turn those little victories into a final, undeniable one. The first move was the one every confident schemer hates the most, making a private public. I walked into the county clerk's office with a folder of evidence and asked to file a complaint. I've been nervous only in the way an old man is nervous when he finally decides to learn his phone's new settings. Plenty of pride, a little fear. The clerk looked at my binder, then at me, and asked general questions I was happy to answer. I signed my name where it mattered and left with a stamped copy of the filing. The complaint referenced forged signatures, fraudulent transfers, and conspiracy to defraud an elder, words heavy enough to make a grown man swallow. Clifton got a letter the next morning. It was short, clinical, and carried the weight of something official. He called, pretending calm, then gave that thinly veiled legal laugh once he heard my name. "Tom, let's talk in private," he said. I did talk to a deputy who followed up and asked polite but pointed questions. Clifton, it turned out, had a file thicker on his desk than he expected. A subpoena for documents followed. He began to sweat where he had always been smug. Roscoe's cooperation came at leisure. The dealer knew his license and reputation were on the line. The list he'd scribbled for me became his bargaining chip. He handed over bills of sale, bank drafts, and phone logs. For a man who once smiled like he owned the room, his face went slack when he realized he'd been dealt instead of dealing. He agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. When a man who profited from your pain points a finger at the men who gave him the goods, you know your evidence is sharp enough. The next move was the slowest and the most satisfying. Legal pressure that made the house of cards wobble. My lawyer, the one I'd called and saved like a spare part, filed civil suits and criminal referrals. The press got wind. Small-town journalism loves a betrayal that smells like family drama. I didn't seek headlines, but once Clifton realized the papers had been filed and Roscoe had flipped, the story had legs. A local news piece ran, neighbors called. My phone filled with messages from people who remember me teaching their sons how to change a clutch. The court of public opinion started to vibrate in time with the court docket. Mark and Jared handled the pressure about, as well as men who expected to inherit a garage handle it. Poorly. They stopped coming around with jokes. Mark tried to text his way out, but texts are only useful when you can explain them. Once subpoenaed, they read like confessions. Jared drove, once past the house slow enough for me to see his hands white on the wheel. Then he drove away. The day the sheriff came with a civil seizure order to take custody of the cars that Roscoe still had, I felt no triumph in seeing metal returned to me. Only the quiet of justice in motion. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined, and louder in the way guilt echoes. Clifton sat stiff. Roscoe leaned back in his chair with that dealer's fatigue, and my nephews had 2 empty seats where bravado used to be. My lawyer did the talking. My job was to hand over the binders, to answer questions about dates and numbers, and how I knew the signatures weren't mine. It felt strange and clean, like wrenching off a rusted bolt and finding fresh threads underneath. Judge Thompson read the documents, asked a few sharp questions, and allowed what I'd hoped for: temporary restraining orders, restitution hearings, and a criminal referral for the forgeries. Civil judgments followed on the heels of criminal notices. The law moves slow, but it moves with certainty when the facts are all in one place. Roscoe agreed to return the Chevy and the other cars still under his control. Clifton's license was suspended pending disciplinary review. My nephews were named in civil actions that carried the promise of financial ruin if they couldn't justify the transfers. The final piece was not in a courtroom, but in a driveway. One crisp morning, Roscoe's transport backed up to my garage and unrolled a tarp. The Chevy's paint caught the light, and for a second the world righted itself. I ran my hand over the hood like a benediction. It was scratched, it smelled of other hands, but it hummed with the same old promise. The other cars trickled back over the following weeks, returned either by court order or by conscience, which is rarer but cleaner. I didn't throw them in the driveway and light cigars. I locked the garage, cataloged every imperfection, and set about restoring what time had blunted. The real satisfaction came later. Legal settlements that forced my nephews to repay more than what they'd taken, an official reprimand for Clifton that kept him from practicing for a while, and Roscoe's business quieted by fines and bad press. The men who thought they could cash in on my recovery found their names on public records and in the margins of small-town paper. It would be a lie to say the hurt evaporated. Trust doesn't come back with a signature on a court order. The family table is forever rearranged. There are things said now only through lawyers. But the work I loved, the cars, the histories, the nights in the garage, started to feel safe again. I had the titles, the trophies, and the satisfaction of watching a slow, legal justice reclaim what was mine. And there's a last, quieter pleasure, pride. Not in the hurt I made them feel, but in the fact that I got up after being under the lights and fixed what was broken in my life with the same patience and stubbornness I'd used to rebuild engines all my life. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you, seriously. You're the reason stories like this get told. If this struck a chord, please subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. What would you have done if it were your collection? If you're a fan of slower burn justice, stick around. I've still got a few more stories in the garage.